We were the only ones down in the bunker. We saw the people dying in the bunker. I just wanted to push him a little.
Have you ever wondered what truly goes on inside the mind of someone who served Adolf Hitler day after day until the final collapsing minutes of the Nazi regime? Not as an infiltrator, not as an enemy, but as a guard, a loyal servant. Picture yourself inside that bunker, hearing the Reich crumble above your head, and carrying the weight of that memory for over 70 years. Until, just before dying, something breaks, and the truth begins to leak. Rochus Misch's story isn't just about survival. It's about what he saw and chose to hide, a silent witness buried behind decades of silence. Until now, the world thought it had heard everything about Hitler. But this letter, discovered in 2025, changes everything. And there's one part of it, still under wraps, that could rewrite history. We'll get there soon. If you value hidden truths, the machinery behind power, and revelations the media never touches, subscribe to the channel right now. We're close to reaching a major milestone, and your support helps us continue creating content that's serious, investigative, and never shallow. By subscribing, you're not just watching, you're joining a community that thinks deeper. Not every monster walks through the front door. Sometimes he starts as an ordinary young man, an orphan, insecure, drifting through a broken country. Rochus Misch wasn't trained to kill or to think. He was trained to obey. And that's exactly what makes his story so disturbing. He wasn't an architect of horror. He was a wire inside the machine, but a wire that heard everything. Born in 1917 into a Germany shattered by hyperinflation, unemployment, and a wounded national pride after the Treaty of Versailles, Misch grew up craving belonging. Like thousands of others, he was drawn to the SS not out of ideology, but necessity, security, a uniform, a place to exist. But there's something rarely mentioned. Entry into the elite SS Guard, the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, wasn't random. In 1938, Misch was accepted into Hitler's personal protection unit. That meant entering the core of the Nazi command structure. It was like walking into the vault, a space where orders were whispered, and loyalty meant more than truth. Misch wasn't just another soldier. He was handpicked to guard the most watched man in Europe. And that placed him in rooms few ever entered, let alone survived. But the most disturbing part isn't what he did. It's what he refused to admit. We'll return to that soon. Rochus Misch wasn't just standing outside Hitler's door. He was the man holding the lines, the literal voice connections between Hitler and his military command. Between encrypted wires and frantic orders, Misch wasn't simply witnessing the war. He was embedded in the cold engineering behind it. He didn't just see the faces of power. He heard their voices, their fears, and their calculations. That placed him dangerously close to the core of the Reich's machinery. From 1940 to 1945, Misch operated at the heart of Nazi decision-making. The Berghof in the Alps, the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, and the infamous Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. It was at the Wolf's Lair where he survived the assassination attempt led by Klaus von Stauffenberg. Misch didn't just survive the blast, he witnessed what came next: growing paranoia, tightened internal control, and a shrinking circle of trust around Hitler. He relayed orders to generals on the crumbling Eastern Front. He watched ministers enter and exit behind closed doors, faces grim, footsteps heavy, silences louder than any speech. Misch later claimed ignorance of the Holocaust, but he was the frontline receiver of battlefield reports, urgent calls, and top-level briefings. He didn't need to see the camps to understand the dark mechanisms at work. As the war turned against Germany, Misch's role shifted from technical to symbolic. He was present not just for the Reich's commands, but for its unraveling. And yet, there's something he saw during those final years that he wouldn't reveal until much, much later. As Soviet forces crushed Berlin block by block, Hitler retreated into the only refuge he had left, the underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Surrounded by concrete and blind loyalty, the end began to unfold, written in paranoia and desperation. Rochus Misch, as communications officer, followed him down, and in doing so, he became one of the last living witnesses to the internal collapse of the Nazi regime. The bunker wasn't just a shelter. It was a sealed capsule where reality ceased to exist. Outside, the world was in ruins. Inside, Hitler kept issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed. Misch watched in silence as the dictator unraveled, blaming everyone but himself, issuing commands into a void, clinging to the illusion of control. Inside this claustrophobic space, Misch observed the daily routine of a dying regime. He saw Goebbels, Bormann, and others attempting to preserve order as everything crumbled. Food was scarce. Fear was thick in the air. Soviet shelling grew louder by the hour. On April 30th, when Hitler and Eva Braun took their lives, Misch was just a few rooms away. He saw their bodies carried up, wrapped, and burned in the Chancellery garden, exactly as instructed. No ceremony, just smoke and silence. Even after Hitler's death, Misch stayed in the bunker for 3 more days. The atmosphere turned unbearable. There was no future left, only waiting. By then, no one spoke of victory, only survival. But there's one detail about those final days that Misch only admitted when no one could question him anymore. Rochus Misch didn't run. When he finally left the bunker, he walked straight into the hands of the Red Army. To the Soviets, he wasn't just another prisoner of war. He was a man who had stood mere feet from Hitler during his final hours. Someone who had heard conversations, witnessed decisions, and possibly knew things no one else did. He became strategic leverage, a living archive, and for that, he spent the next 9 years in captivity. Between interrogations and forced labor, Misch was transferred from camp to camp, cut off from the world. The Soviets weren't just trying to confirm Hitler's death. They wanted insight into the hidden world behind the bunker walls. They wanted to decode the mind that had led Europe into destruction. Every session pressed Misch for more. Names, phrases, facial expressions, anything that could have slipped past the Western lens. But Misch, as always, knew how to survive. He said little, repeated the same line, that he was just a soldier, a technician, unaware of the true scope of what happened around him. That defense became his armor for nearly a decade. When he was finally released in 1954, he returned to West Berlin like a ghost, one many preferred not to confront. No trial, no formal charges, just silence. For nearly half a century, he stayed anonymous. He opened a small shop, avoided interviews, refused to discuss the regime. His name disappeared from headlines, but not from intelligence archives. Some say he was released because of his low rank. Others believe it was because of what he didn't reveal. But something remained hidden, something he kept buried until the world no longer had the power to ask. For decades, Rochus Misch lived on the edge of the history he had witnessed. But in the early 2000s, something changed. He began giving interviews, appearing in documentaries, and eventually published his memoirs. The title was telling, The Last Witness. But the content was unsettling. Misch spoke of Hitler with familiarity, sometimes even warmth. He called him a wonderful boss. There was no remorse, just repetition. He had done his job. When asked about the Holocaust, he was blunt. It was never a topic. In another interview, he acknowledged knowing about concentration camps, but claimed ignorance of their scale. "We weren't part of those conversations," he said. The backlash was swift. To many, Misch was attempting to rewrite his image. Others believed he was simply stating the truth. But there was something deeply disconcerting in his tone. He seemed more troubled by how history judged him than by the regime's crimes. This made Misch even more controversial. Some saw him as a soldier caught in the current of history. Others viewed him as complicit, or worse, willfully silent. But few knew that even as he spoke publicly, he was still hiding something. A final fragment of truth he chose not to share while alive. And this is where the narrative shifts. Because Misch's silence wasn't complete. He wrote, and he concealed, a document that wouldn't surface until after his death. And what it reveals forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about him. In 2025, during a routine renovation in an old Berlin apartment, workers stumbled upon something they were never meant to find. Hidden inside a wall, sealed in an airtight metal box, was a yellowed envelope. The signature at the bottom corner confirmed the unthinkable: Rochus Misch. The letter was dated 2012, just months before his death, and it opened with a sentence that changed everything. "I can't keep silent anymore." Within a few handwritten pages, Misch dismantled decades of public denial. He hadn't just heard rumors, he had seen the horrors firsthand. And what he described went far beyond the official records of the Reich's final days. Misch detailed the execution of suspected traitors, buried alive under direct orders. He described poison experiments conducted on prisoners, ordered by Hitler himself, with meticulous timing and repeated tests. He wrote that Hitler watched from behind bulletproof glass, taking notes. And he quoted the dictator with chilling clarity: "Justice sleeps best underground." But there was more. Misch described the case of a young girl allegedly gifted to Hitler by a senior officer. Days later, she was found dead near the Berghof mountain retreat. The official story claimed it was an enemy ambush, but Misch believed it was something far darker, a liability quietly erased. He wrote of the nightmares that haunted him. "I see their faces at night. I hear voices beneath the ground," he confessed. "I lied to protect myself, but silence is a form of guilt." The letter's authenticity remains under review, but sources close to the investigation say the level of detail, the specific phrasing, and cross-referenced facts make forgery unlikely. If verified, this document may force a brutal reassessment of the silent complicity within Hitler's inner circle. And there's one final line in the letter, still undisclosed. It may contain a name, and that name, some believe, belongs to someone still alive. Rochus Misch died in 2013, at age 96, without ever facing formal charges. His death seemed to close an uncomfortable chapter in history. No remorse, no trial, no accountability. But the letter, found more than a decade later, revealed something deeper than guilt. It revealed calculation. Misch didn't want to face consequences in life. He chose instead to write the truth and hide it behind a wall, trusting that time would do what he never had the courage to. This isn't just about one man's cowardice. It's about the architecture of silence, the way totalitarian regimes construct not only camps, but minds trained to obey, to remain silent, to survive. Misch was a product of that system, but he was also complicit. By calling himself just a phone operator, he tried to separate himself from the machine he helped sustain. But now we know. He didn't just listen. He saw, and he chose to pretend he didn't. The letter is still under review, but it has already triggered intense debate among memory institutions, historians, and survivors. Some demand it be released in full. Others fear the consequences of its darkest details. At the center of it all is one unanswered question. Why did he wait until the end to tell the truth? Was it guilt? Or a final attempt to control how he'd be remembered? Misch took his secrets as far as he could. But what he left behind forces us to see the past without illusions. Because when the last of those who saw everything finally speaks, even too late, history shifts. And when it shifts, it never returns to where it once was. Rochus Misch's story ends as it began, in silence. But now, it's a different kind of silence. No longer the silence of obedience or omission. It's the silence after a revelation. The pause before impact. Because when even the most loyal guard chooses to break decades of denial with a single hidden letter, what emerges is not just the rot of a regime, but the collapse of any claim to moral neutrality in the face of horror. Misch didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't seek justice. He simply wrote. And that alone is enough to reopen wounds, ignite debates, and force us to confront what history often prefers to bury. His final confession doesn't redeem. It exposes. It shows that there is no neutral position when serving evil, even in silence, even in the shadows. We may never know if he wrote out of guilt, fear, or ego, but the content is undeniable. He saw, he knew, and still he chose to wait. The question now is, how many others still carry stories like his, hidden beneath the weight of passing decades? Because in the end, truth never erupts all at once. It seeps, slowly, like smoke, like dust slipping through the cracks of an old ceiling. Like a letter, sealed behind the wall of history. Nothing Misch wrote can be confirmed by him. The letter, as detailed as it is, stands as a posthumous monologue, a final reckoning without rebuttal. And perhaps that's what makes it so unsettling. The absence of response. Because when a narrative like this resurfaces from the past, what's at stake isn't just what it reveals, but what it demands we confront. Archives have been reopened, experts consulted, survivors warned. And what's now in question isn't the legacy of a former soldier. It's the entire structure of how we remember the fall of the Third Reich. If Misch's words are proven true, and evidence suggests they are, we're not simply adding another puzzle piece. We're being handed a harsh new lens on human behavior under absolute command. Some horrors weren't committed by monsters. They were carried out by ordinary men, in silence, with precision, with order. The story of Rochus Misch forces us to accept that evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just whispers, and those who hear it stay silent for decades.